Hello participants. We all know that climate change is a reality now, and we hear of extreme weather events and the torrential rains that are taking place nowadays so frequently. Now, this has added to flood all around the globe, and Indian rivers are no exception. They too have become more aggressive, over the years, every year you hear of some floods taking place, devastating floods taking place in different parts of India. But putting the entire blame on climate change is not correct. The overemphasis on the climate change actually tries to downsize the anthropogenic changes. When I say anthropogenic changes, I'm talking about the human-induced changes. So historically, we have seen that there has been a policy shift from living with the flood to controlling flood. So in this talk, you would understand that the unique character of the rivers in the Ganga Basin in India, how it is, and how different it is from various other rivers of the world, and how the Ganga and its tributaries actually behave. We are taking Mid-Ganga section as a case to understand how floods are actually perceived in rural landscapes. You would also learn to engage with questions on the changing policy shift from living with the flood to controlling flood. You will also know about the structural methods used by humans to deal with the flood. So putting it in some kind of historical perspective, I will tell you about the difference between environmental friendly and hard structural methods. So I think, the Ganga, let me tell you a little bit about the Ganga. The Ganga has many tributaries, and the river is intricately connected with the life of the people in the Mid-Ganga Basin. So, the communities living in the Mid-Ganga plain are basically enriched by many myths and, rituals. So you have a lot of rituals connected with the rivers in the Ganga Basin. Now, in popular perception, the Ganga carries an image of goddess, and this emerges from the popular perception says that the Ganga emerged from the jata, the locks of Lord Shiva, and this perception is quite old, and people have prayed the holy Ganga and they have taken a ritualistic dip in it. But this is not the entire story of the Ganga. As an environmental historian, the more important part of the story, I can say, has actually remained unsaid. So look at this slide here. In this map, India, you can see that India is fed by rivers all around. And the second adjacent map is of the Mid-Ganga Basin. The Ganga actually flows right at the center of the region, that is the northern part of India, and it goes from north to east. Now, the Mid-Ganga Basin is the middle part of the Ganga, and here the Ganga is more spread out because of the flatter plain. It has historically been agriculturally rich area. So today the region could no longer actually boast of its natural river ecology. Let me tell you, it has seen major transformations over the last many years. The Ganga is actually terribly polluted river today, and the groundwater in the plain has become highly contaminated. Even the arsenic levels, they have reached alarming proportions. So this has made people vulnerable to many diseases because of the arsenic. Now, all these changes happened over the last few decades. And at the core of the entire problem remains the attempt by humans to control the rivers, and that we will see in this case. So As I mentioned, that the Ganga actually originates in the Himalayas, but when it reaches the Mid-Ganga section, it flows from west to east. And many rivers meet its actually natural channels. All these rivers, like you have Gomati, Ghaggar, Gandak, Kosi, all these rivers, they all alight from the Himalayas and they all meet the Ganga from the northern side. There are, of course, few rivers which are coming from south, like you have Betwa, Chambal, Kane, and Son rivers. These rivers actually originate in the central Indian craton and they feed the Ganga basin on the southern side. So due to the descent from the Himalayan mountains, the rivers draining the Mid-Ganga basin, the middle section, which has a flatter plain, huge amount of fine sediments actually get deposited during the flood times. Now, let me show you another map here. In this slide, you can look at the huge flood-prone area in the Mid-Ganga section. Here, the flow of water is more spread out due to the congregation of different rivers from both north and south. Now, this sediment, which is coming from the Himalayas, it gets deposited in the floodplain area, and because flood takes place almost every year. But this deposition of the sediment is very useful for agriculture because it carries many minerals. Now, the sediments deposited during the flood, although often obstruct the flow of the rivers also. So, once the flood recedes, these rivers often cut new paths, and because it's a hugely spread out riverbed. Now, this frequent avulsion river that I'm talking about is very common in the region. Now, all this is the character of the Mid-Ganga Basin and the Ganga and its tributaries. But you know what happened in the 19th century? The problem actually began in the later half of the 19th century. Now, what has changed in the 19th century? The land revenue maximization actually became the dominant motive of the British East India Company, and particularly in this region, because the East India Company had got the Diwani right of Bengal, which actually covered this part of Mid-Ganga area also. And as a result, the age-old idea of not disturbing the natural flow, it actually went into the background, because then you have the land revenue collection as the main motive. So you don't want to actually lose your crops. Now, to safeguard its revenues, the colonial government went on to pass the Bengal Embankment Act in 1882. The fact is that in the past, the region already had the history of protection from floods through the traditional bunds and embankments, because all these embankments that we hear of today, these were also known as bunds at that time. Now, they were erected in order to prevent the incursion of the rivers in the cultivable land, because when the water were raised to an unusual height, these embankments control those flood waters. Now, obviously, so that means this area already had the tradition of creation of embankments. But there is one very renowned engineer of the late 19th century, and I was going through his account. His name is William Wilcock, and he suggested that the colonial engineers were possibly misled by the success of their flood control projects that they had undertaken in Punjab and the United Provinces, which is the northwestern part of India. But the geomorphology of the Mid-Ganga Basin was completely different. So, and therefore, when the British applied the same policy, that is controlling the flood, they actually did a blunder. Because in Punjab and United Province, the shifting channels of the river had been affecting the public works effort, because the irrigation channels were being dug up. So, and that's why they came up with the flood protection idea also. So they schemed to redirect rivers into the channels through the embankments it actually suited the government at that time, and it worked very well in Punjab and the United Province. The cultivators in the pre-colonial past in this part of Mid-Ganga Basin had evolved a tradition of flood utilization, basically, and they depended on flood act. In the, if you look at the older documents, you will find that people are not trying to control flood through the long embankments. Obviously there are embankments there, but these embankments were constructed only to save the habitations. So in the old embankments, the height was deliberately kept to such a height that could protect the habitation only, and the flood water was actually allowed to enter into the cultivable field. And this was done through the dug up breaches. So even when there were embankments, smaller height embankments, they dug up breaches every year. Now these small breaches were dug up from the rivers to cultivable fields. And the British engineers, what they thought when they came there into that area, they thought, and in fact this was a mistake, basically, they considered these silted up canals, because these canals were always silted up after the flood got receded. So later on it appeared as a silted up canals. So they thought that these are basically something like dead rivers. So they thought that let's finish it off. So they came up with the idea of stopping such breaches. Now look at this slide here. Now this is a graph that I've drawn, which tells you about the traditional embankment. The traditional embankments were built with the purpose. In fact, a cut was made in these embankments every rainy season, and this was for the sake of actually regulating the inland drainage. So they were repaired for use again and again, because once the river water, the flood receded or the rains ceased, these were repaired. So these were repairable every year. There was new breaches constructed, as I mentioned earlier. Now the smaller bunds, which I have mentioned here as a Bhiri bund, it actually ran at the right angle from the the outer inner bunds, which actually subdivided the space between the two, that the river and the main embankment. Now these were basically intended to retain the water within the subdivision. In case what if so it so happens that because of the more flood or a more intense flood, the water overflows the embanked area, then the Bhiri bunds, the smaller bunds, the subdivisions would accumulate the surplus water. So basically it stopped the flow over the whole space. Now in nutshell, the inundation in these parts were not considered as a problem at all. The British administration could not understand the significance of these conventional embankments, which had evolved over a long period of time. And this had come up from the experience of flooding, basically, by the local communities. And it was so because it was now you see a change by the colonial government, because the colonial government was more concerned with the collection of fixed and sustained revenue from the cultivable fields. So it basically felt that these conventional embankments had failed to to achieve its objectives, and so the embankments have to be made more stronger, and the height of these embankments has to be increased. So the engineers contemplated the idea of filling up the earlier cuts, and they strengthened the embankments along the river, the entire river channel, as some kind of a flood protection device. And this was done to safeguard the crop. Now, embanking the rivers in Mid-Ganga Basin with some kind of a permanent structure was never a suitable idea, because obviously the rivers carried huge amount of silt. So in the long run, it had resulted in the arsenic contamination of the groundwater. there has now been a massive use of fertilizers in the cultivable area, because now the natural silt deposition process has stopped. So I told you that how, you know, the structures that we create to control the flood can be of different variety. You know, the traditional kind of structures were more environmental friendly, right? But now, when the British came, they came up with more long embankments, which were very hard structures. Which these structures actually has led to the deterioration of the floodplain area. Thank you so much.